What happened in the Legacy Showcase Challenge, our first big event of the year? Is Turbo Goblin still on top? Stick around and let's find out. I'm Matt Chow, and let's look at last week in Legacy. As always, let's start with the Legacy League results. League results are only indicative of what is winning in Magic Online leagues. That said, they can often be a leading indicator of what is to come. This field was slightly larger than previous weeks, which is why we compare percentages instead of copies played. Our top league decks from last week, Grixis Delver and Turbo Goblins, are still on top, representing 18 5-0 results each. Delver increased in representation by 4.5%, while Turbo Goblins declined by just over 1%. Dimir Scam stayed pretty flat, with 16 results, representing around 9% of these results. These three decks made up a staggering 30% of results. Reanimator and Boros Initiative both gained roughly 2% metagame share. Sultai Beans lost 1%, while Rhinos gained 1. Some other cool and notable results to share. The current iteration of Tony Scaponi's Artifact deck, now running Coveted Jewel and Transmute Artifact, put up 5 results. I've been calling this deck Jewel Artifacts, but please let me know if it has an actual name yet, because it's definitely a real deck. Rakdos Scam is becoming more popular with 5 results as well. This deck is similar to the Grief Reanimate Mono Black Aggro Scam decks, but this one plays red for Fury, Fable, Bolt, and Molten Collapse. Another super cool and exciting one, Belcher put up 2 results, including a cool version that had Black Rituals, Beseech, Entomb, and Echo of Eons. Brian Cook posted gameplay with the Black Belcher list this week. Definitely worth checking out over on his Epic Storm channel. We also have a Dimir Scam Reanimator hybrid deck with 2 results. It's kind of closer to the Dimir Scam deck, but it does have an Entomb package for Atraxa and Archon of Cruelty, adding an extra dimension to that game plan. All of these decks are definitely worth keeping an eye on. Moving on to prelim and challenge results. Since they started publishing more data, we have all the deck lists from each event along with their final standings. This lets us compare overall field representation to how many of each deck finished with a positive record. In these events, Turbo Goblins is still the top represented deck, comprising 12.25% of the field and overperforming its metagame share by 11%. Grixis Delver is close behind, making up 11.33% and overperforming by a more modest 7%. Our next most popular deck was Sultai Beans, which has fallen considerably since the first week of the year. It did make up nearly 11% of the field, but it did underperform by over 15%. Reanimator was the most popular combo deck, coming in at 8% of the field, but underperformed by a small margin. I don't even want to talk about Sneak and Show. I like the deck, and every week, its performance makes me sad. Boros Initiative punched well above its weight here. We've seen it a lot less since Turbo Goblins got popular. It made up about 5% of the field and had a roughly 50% conversion rate, which is pretty good. I do think that it may have a better Delver matchup than Goblins, which could explain some of the result we're seeing here. Moving on, at 4% of the field, Rhinos and Scam each performed well, approximately on par with the Grixis Delver results. The 4 and 5C Bant Beans decks did quite well in these events, converting at a very high rate of 57%. Most of these lists were 5 colors, with black for Bowmasters and red for 4th Year Lingus. Looking at week over week in metagame averages next, there were fewer prelims and challenges this week than prior week. These results have a smaller impact on our weighted averages. So far this year, Turbo Goblins has been the deck to beat, and this remains the case here. On average, it makes up 9% of our challenge and prelim metagame. It overperformed by 13.5%, with a metagame share growing 4% week over week compared to prior week. Grixis Delver saw a growth of 1.5% week over week, with average field penetration of 8.5% and a performance of 9% above expected. Reanimator is the 3rd most popular deck, averaging 8% of the field, but consistently underperforming by a small margin. Dimir Scam has been decreasing in share week over week, down to 4.25% last week, but it still performs highly. Despite an abysmal week, averaged out across the month, Sultai Beans still has a large metagame share and good results. Initiative, Bandex Beans decks, and Temur Delver are all around 4 to 5% of the field averaged and have overperformed on average. Lands and Moonstompy remain around 3% of the field, with Lands performing roughly as expected and Moonstompy underperforming by nearly 15% this month. In our averages, both Doomsday and Sneak and Show comprise less than 3% of the field, both significantly underperforming. Doomsday was really good during December, so I'm kind of curious what's going on here. It is possible that Delver becoming more popular has begun pushing Doomsday out of contention. It's also possible that Doomsday players are picking up the deck, newer Doomsday players, and they're not quite proficient with it yet. Like I said, not talking about Sneak and Show makes me sad. Acast is being played in small numbers, but it has consistently overperformed, which is cool to see. The metagame seems pretty healthy, with Turbo Goblins and Delver settling into the top spots. We'll have to see if this remains stable or if another metagame shift is in our near future. Now for what I'm excited about. Hopefully you are too. We had 266 players in the Magic Online Legacy Showcase Challenge January 21st. Lots of decks, top players, and some cool stuff to go over. Baku 91 finished in first place, winning the tournament with Temur Delver. This list played a main deck counterbalance and only 2 copies of Questing Druid Seek the Beast, compared to the typical 4 copies we usually find. Turn 1 Glistener Elf came in second with a pretty stock Moonstompy list. Third, we have a classic version of Dimir Scam piloted by Jake TMS. This version isn't playing any of the more recent tech that folks are exploring, such as Stalactite Stalker, Delver of Secrets, and Whale of the Forgotten. Tenjay came in 4th place with Turbo Goblins. Like most lists, Tenjay is playing 4 copies of Chalice of the Void, a recent change in the archetype that helps against some of its worst matchups like Delver and Combo. Next up is a spicy one. Namor Squad secured 5th place with Dimir Scam, but not regular Dimir Scam, Hogak Scam, with Stitcher's Supplier and Cabal Therapies. Namor Squats was 8-1 going into top 8, which is a pretty impressive result. Larson finished 6th with a Stoneforge Mystic build of Cephalid Breakfast. In 7th, we have another Turbo Goblins list piloted by Mav40121. Notably, this list does not have any main deck Chalice of the Void. Instead, they're in the sideboard. Closing at our top 8, we have Pinto MTG piloting 8cast. Congrats to all the top 8 players, especially Baku 91 for winning the event. Looking at our metagame breakdown and conversion rates, this table shows all decks played by 5 or more players, plus any archetype that had a top 8 finish that was played by fewer than 5 pilots. I tend to like conversion rates more than win rate when interpreting the data. I'll touch on why in a bit. Our top 8 consisted of several decks that were played in small numbers. Hogak Scam only had 2 total copies, 8cast and Breakfast only had 3 each. Temur Delver made up under 2% of the metagame with 5 pilots. Apart from our eventual winner, none of the Temur pilots even managed to crack X and 3. Each of the aforementioned decks only had 1 player go deep into the tournament, and their small sample size makes it very difficult to assess their overall results. Looking at the larger portions of the metagame, Moonstompy made up 4% of the field and had a split result. 2 players made top 16, with 1 in top 8. Outside of these 2, none of the other pilots made X3 or better. Turbo Goblins had a much more balanced result, overperforming across the board. It was 8.25% of the field, with a positive conversion rate into X and 3 or better, top 32, top 16, and it put 2 copies into top 8. Comprising almost 5% of the field, Dimir Scam underperformed into X and 3 or better, but did put 2 pilots into top 16, with 1 of them making top 8. Blue-Black Rescaminator was played by 5 players, 3 of whom had records of 6-3 or better, with 1 of those players making it into top 16. I imagine that some of this deck's success came from it being a new hybrid of 2 existing successful decks. Opponents may not have known how to board against it or what things to prioritize. Grixis Delver made up 12% of the overall field and 15% of the top 32 metagame. It also put 2 players into top 16. This is a significant overperformance, but it did underperform into X and 3. Sultai Beans and Rhinos were each 7 to 8% of the field, Initiative and Doomsday each at 2 to 3%. Reanimator was 11-ish% and performed roughly 50% under expectations, a very poor performance. Lands, Bantex Beans, and Cradle Control had similarly poor results. Looking at win rates next, I sourced all match results to build win rates from the Legacy Data Collection project with their permission. Their Discord and Patreon links are in the comments for you to check out. At a surface level, win rates can be misleading when explored with no further context. The perfect example of this is shown with Grixis Delver and Reanimator. They had virtually identical win rates between 47.5% and 48%, each with more than 150 matches played. But Grixis Delver had strong results where Reanimator bombed out. We might look at this data and assume that both decks performed slightly below average. This chart shows the distribution of players at each number of match wins during Swiss. The green line indicates the distribution of the tournament as a whole, red shows the Grixis Delver results, and blue is for Reanimator. We can see that 60% of Reanimator players finished with 0 to 2 wins, so 0, 1, or 2 wins. Grixis Delver had a similar 59.4% in this range, with the overall tournament distribution at 52% finishing in this range. Both Delver and Reanimator had a higher than expected number of players finish at the bottom of this tournament between 0 and 2 wins. As we move along our graph, Grixis had 22% of players finish between 3 and 5 wins. Reanimator had 30% finish in this range, with the expected result based on the tournament as a whole being 28.5%. This means that Reanimator had a higher number of players finish middle of the pack around 4 wins, while Delver had fewer players finish in this range than expected. Looking at 6 to 8 wins, these are our top tables, possible top 8 contention, prize support, that kind of thing. Keep in mind that our expected result is for our remaining 19.5% of players to finish at X3 or better. Reanimator put 10% of its pilots into this range, whereas Delver put nearly 19% into this range. This difference in distribution shows why it's important to look beyond the win rate of any given deck when exploring tournament results. Both decks had essentially the same win rate, drastically different results in terms of performance. With that said though, let's look at some win rates. We just looked at Grixis Delver and Reanimator as examples of how win rates can mislead us. But looking at win rates within specific matchups can be educational, provided we have enough data to draw on. I've talked about format pillars before. Currently our metagame is centered around 3 archetypes. Red Ancient Tomb Stompy decks, including Turbo Goblins, Initiative, and Moon Stompy. Delver Tempo decks, these being Grixis Delver and Temur Delver. And finally, the Beans decks, Sultai, and then 4 and 5C Bant Beans. Knowing how each deck performs against each pillar of the format is useful, as combined, the pillars represent nearly 40% of the field. I don't want to put too much stock in these results, as they are small sample sizes compared to something like Eternal Weekend, and smaller sample sizes inherently have more noise in the data. So here's my brief overview of my findings. As expected, Stompy beats Beans, which beats Delver, which beats Stompy. These matchups are closer than they used to be, though. This is a classic rock, paper, scissors metagame type of format. Sultai Beans have adopted main deck Stifles and Dress Downs in occasion, which can mitigate a lot of the pressure from the Stompy decks, especially Goblins and Initiative. The matchup gap between Beans and Delver is wider though, with Sultai winning 70+% against the Delver variants. Both Temur and Grixis Delver went slightly positive against Stompy, specifically beating Turbo Goblins. Our top win rates of the tournament were Boros Initiative, Temur Delver, and Breakfast all above 55%, with Dimir Riskaminator 8-cast above 60%, and the Dimir Hogak Scam deck breaking 70% win rate. Just keep in mind that these decks were played in very small quantities except for Initiative and are likely not going to be representative of a larger sample size. This is a matchup matrix showing the 17 decks with the most matches played. These are super small sample sizes given the size of the tournament, but they can be informative nonetheless. If you want a deeper dive on the results from a matchup matrix and legacy analysis in general, check out my Eternal Weekend analysis where we had a combined field that was more than 10 times the size of this tournament. For the Showcase Challenge, there were a few results that stood out to me. I'm surprised that Rhinos went positive against Turbo Goblins. It's a small margin, but I guess Force, Wasteland, and Crashing Footfalls is enough interaction and pressure to get the job done. Reanimator won 15 of 24 matches played against Grixis Delver, which is surprising to me. My experience has been positive to favored while playing the Delver side of the matchup, and while playing the Reanimator side, it feels like an uphill battle. Many of these Reanimator lists had a sideboard Witherbloom Apprentice combo package, and I wonder if that changes the dynamics significantly compared to my experiences. Boros Initiative won the Grixis Delver matchup 3-1. It's a small sample size, but this lines up with what I was speculating earlier when we were discussing the prelim and challenge data. It is more resilient to Stifle than Turbo Goblins, it can often main deck Chalice, and sometimes even Trinisphere, while they're not also relying on Sticker Goblin to be able to actually power out their clock. With Delver seeing a resurgence, we might see Ancient Tomb players move back onto Initiative if this result is representative of the matchup as a whole. The Bantex Beans decks versus Temur Rhinos is also kind of interesting. Rhinos won the pairing 6-1. In the matchup, fast pressure from Crashing Footfalls backed up by Forces, Wasteland, and then closing out with Minsc and Boog allows the deck to attack Beans on multiple angles. In other news, Grixis Delver lost to Lands 2-8, surprising absolutely no one. Overall, it's very exciting to see this many people playing Legacy. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to the Legacy Data Collection Project for providing me with the match result data that they painstakingly scraped manually. If you want to see how the metagame has evolved week over week, check out the prior weeks in this series for January 1-7 and 8-15 for how our Magic Online metagame has shifted over time. If you want a real deep dive on Legacy, check out I Love Legacy and I Love Spreadsheets, the hour-long video I did breaking down all of the results and all of the data from the Eternal Weekend events in fall 2023. All that data is still super relevant in January 2024, as not much has changed in the format beyond individuals tuning and adjusting decks.